Welcome to the Listen to Your Footsteps podcast. I'm your host, Kojo Bafun, and this podcast is an extension of my book, also called Listen to Your Footsteps, which is a collection of essays, reflections, and poetry on things like fatherhood, identity and belonging, growing up, creativity, and the lessons learned. The purpose of this podcast is to gain insight and learn from the journeys that others have taken. I explore the worlds of art, culture, design, business, creativity, and life from the perspective of Africans who are contributing to the redefinition of the continent and who we are. Well, my guest for this episode is somebody I've been following on social media for some years now, fascinated by his journey. So he's a lecturer, DJ, writer, and creative arts and culture specialist. Kobby Graham, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Wow.
Also, there's also music curator in there and a whole bunch of other things.
Yes.
I feel slightly better about myself.
You're a man of many talents too.
It's just banding around a lot of titles, depending on who you're talking to at the time.
Because I feel like everyone else who they get educated, they throw around all of the letters and stuff. It's like this and MA and PhD and this. I'm just like, I'll tell you what I do and you can figure it out. Yeah.
Well, that said, you have what, LLB and MA?
I do. And I'm in the middle of a PhD.
In the middle of a PhD. So let's go back. What did you want to be when you grow up?
Oh my goodness. So the first thing I ever remember wanting to be was Indiana Jones, very specifically. And so I look back now and I'm like, okay, well, he was an academic. He wore a hat pretty often as well. All that's left is the whip. Yeah. So yeah, I'm getting there slowly. Then after I realized Indiana Jones wasn't real, then I wanted to be Steven Spielberg for his role in the creation of Indiana Jones. So for the longest time, I wanted to be a film director. Then at some point in time, I wanted to be an architect. Then I've just never settled on any one thing. I just know the things that I love, and those have tended to be writing and music. And so those are the things that have pushed me in all the directions that I've gone.
I do find that interesting that, for example, you have an LLB in law, but a master's in international studies and diplomacy. And now a PhD, you're doing PhD
in sociology
and focusing on things like Ghana's alternative music scene.
Exactly. Basically, I did the law degree not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but because I am the African son of African parents, and you can't go up to your African parents and just be like, yeah, so I want to study English. They're like, okay, you want to study English literature so that you can be what? Literate. Okay. I picked law because they're like, okay, well, you can talk. So I think you should try law. And I got in. And the only thing I knew at the end of it, well, maybe two things. I knew that, for one, I didn't want to be a lawyer. When I would speak to my classmates, I could see the fire in their eyes when they would talk about the law. And the only thing that put fire in my eyes was when I'd be talking about pop culture related things like, I don't know, Bobby Brown and Whitney or something like that. So I did a gap year in between. And I would say that's when things really started to get interesting. I went to work for this magazine that was based in the UK called Untold. And it was kind of like Black GQ before that kind of thing existed. And they just introduced me to popular culture. And it was the first place where my kind of almost obsessive pop culture knowledge was regarded as relevant and cool and useful. And so I did that for a gap year. I knew I was going to do a master's. The only part of the law that interested me was the international aspects. So I went back to the same university and did international studies and diplomacy. And I finished that, and for like a number of years, I was trying to get kind of like think tank kind of work or UN kind of work, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I graduated around the time of like 9/11, and the job market had just shrunk. Like you could barely get temping work. And I was in the UK at this point in time. And yeah, like things weren't really coming together. But I think now that like at the beginning of one's career, like when you leave university, you don't know so much what you want to do. So you take the opportunities that you're given, and they eventually lead you where you need to go to. And I think that's kind of what's happened with me. I was floating around London for a bit, and my dad had moved to Ghana when my parents divorced in like 86. And so he was pretty much like, there is nothing for you in that country.
Yeah.
Until you come to Ghana, nothing will happen for you. And so I got this internship that brought me to Ghana for a few months, and it allowed me to dip my toes in the water. This was like 18 years ago. And I decided I was going to move back. So I just went back to London, packed everything, and I moved. And I've just been really lucky because this wasn't my first time living in Ghana. When I was a kid, my parents sent me to Ghana to live with my grandmother away from Accra, like in Cape Coast. And so I got the chance to like just finish primary school, do most of secondary school, learn at least one of our many local languages. So I speak Fanti, and so I know how to read it, speak it, write it. And that has definitely given me an edge in terms of moving back. It's made it, it's coming home as opposed to just entering like the new world of Africa, Yeah. So I've been quite lucky. But job-wise, I've just moved from like, I think when I got back, every other year I'd be offered a new job. Like like one thing would just lead to another. So it's like I worked for my dad for a while, just kind of installing security systems. Then one of our clients, a director there, had a market research company called Stedman. So I went there to do business development there. Then one of our clients was Joy FM. And so then I moved to Joy FM. I became a journalist for a year. And then actually for about 6 months, then they moved me over to social media, which was just kind of popping off at the time. So like I was one of the early adopters of like Twitter, Facebook, that kind of stuff. Then from there, I went to the Constitution Review Commission. Ghana was reviewing its constitution, and they needed someone to handle the social media end of things. So I think I did that. Then I went and did a presentation at Ashesi University. That went really well. One thing led to another. I ended up at Ashesi University, and I taught there for about 8 years. And then I left there about 3 years ago. And I've just been doing the PhD since, and still teaching at Webster University.
Where were you born?
So I was born in London. Okay. My parents were like educational migrants. So my mum,
like a lot of us.
Yeah, basically. She was a nurse originally. And my dad was in the UK to study accounting. So they met over there. And so they had me and my younger brother. And so I was in London between 77 when I was born and 87, which is when I first moved to Ghana.
Okay. Yeah, you've jumped around quite a bit, right?
Oh yeah.
So how did you? It feels like you've been able to find a way of, even though you went, for example, into law, without the intention or the drive to become a lawyer. It does feel like that has also served as an underpinning for some of the other things that you've done?
Oh, definitely. I think, I mean, like my mom knew that the law was not what I was about, but she also knew that when you say law, it opens doors. And so I cannot say I've not benefited from that. I'm sure that, like, especially earlier in my career, just having law on my CV was like, oh, okay, so he's clearly a smart person or something like that. So it's definitely opened doors. But I would say that the thing that was most influential in terms of my trajectory was the gap year that I did and working for Untold. That's where I met Ezeko Akimian, this half Nigerian, half Romanian dude, who would end up teaching me how to DJ. For example, he was the assistant music editor, and yeah, he and a friend of his, Jean-Claude. This was like the early days of neo soul in the UK, and so they had this idea of doing a night dedicated to just neo soul and all of the kind of less popular forms of Black music that were existent in the UK at the time. And so it was like neo soul, broken beat, like old school funk, rare groove, all of that kind of stuff. And so I would just tag along because that was the kind of music I was into. And so after some time, I just kept like prodding Ezeko, and I'd be like, Zach, yo, you know what song you should play next? You should play this song. You should play this song. And one day he's like, it's okay. You know what? I'll just teach you to DJ. I know you have music. And so he taught me how to DJ, and I joined the team. And so it's through that I discovered kind of creative community. I met a lot of the people that I still know today. And so somewhere between like writing for Untold magazine, DJing with Ezeko, chilling with just creatives, and just going to creative events, I think that was really my home. I just didn't know what to do with it. And so I had to do that thing of, it's like, on the one hand, you know, you're a creative and you have creative ambitions, but then the real life is there. And so you have to like do the real life things as well until you can kind of marry them. And so it's really interesting to me that right now I'm doing a PhD in sociology. And the thing that made me eligible for this, because I'm doing it under a scholarship, is my interest in the creative arts. And so it's kind of come full circle for me, where like finally I'm getting the chance to actually study essentially like the relationship between music and society, and write about it, and have opportunities come to me that are to do with the stuff that really and truly started with my gap year working at that magazine.
So what's always intrigued, or that what's always fascinated me, is that your approach to it and the lens through which you interact with these different spaces. Because, for example, you talk about DJing. For most people, you go and become a DJ and you try to build a career as a DJ, you know, DJ in larger places, get bigger gigs, etc., etc. Whereas for you, it's always felt like there's a certain, let's say, not necessarily depth to it, but there's a certain seriousness to it that leans into, as you just described, the other things that you're interested in.
Okay. Yeah. I think like I take music really seriously. I love music, and I think maybe it's partly because of just being raised between kind of the UK and Ghana, and being exposed to different people from different parts of the world, and then also just tapping into like the creative underground. So like I've just always been interested in music, but not just music in terms of the sound, but also in terms of the people. My younger brother, my late younger brother, he was a musician, and I think around the time we moved to Ghana, so I was like 9 going on 10, and he was 2 years younger than me. I remember at the age of 7, Ebo was like, I'm going to be a musician. And I watched him kind of go through the motions. Secondary school finished. He managed to get into uni, and again, he's not going to be able to study music. So he randomly picks politics. And so he ends up studying politics, but then he doesn't, because while he's doing this, again, he's doing the thing of keeping his creativity going on the side.
Yeah.
And so he's been rapping and rapping and rapping. At this point in time, he knows how to play like the trombone, he knows how to DJ, he plays the drums, etc., etc. And he did a guest appearance on this group. They're like some recording. They were called Foreign Beggars. And it worked so well that they were like, do you want to join the group? And so he just dropped out of university first year. And he had a choice between going to university or going on tour. And he went on tour and never looked back. And so I think somewhere between my brother being a musician, me just being interested in creativity as a whole, I think, if anything, I'm a writer first and foremost, but like, okay, I am just a music nerd. Like, I am geeky about music. And I guess maybe we both get that from our dad, who I just remember when we were kids, like he would line the walls with like his vinyl collection. So I just remember one of my earliest memories is the Bob Marley album, I think Uprising.
Yeah.
It's Bob Marley emerging from a volcano, and he has,
I think it's like like an illustration to a certain extent with like grays and stuff. Yeah.
And it used to scare the bejesus out of me. And it's one of my earliest memories. So like, I think we may have got it from my dad, but basically we were both really geeky about music. My brother was geeky about rap. I was geeky about soul. But then we'd have these conversations, and so we get to know about like both genres. And we just kept it moving. So for me, it's always been something that it means something, as opposed to just, oh, it's for shits and giggles. Like, you can dance. Like, music has always had real depth for me.
Because it also feels like you have an eye for the, I don't want to say, let's say, less than mainstream. It feels like you gravitate more to that. Like, I have discovered music through your playlists.
I see. I think for me, that definitely comes from, it comes from two sources, actually. There's a poet in the UK called Jacob Sam LaRose, who, so when we moved to Ghana, my younger brother, he only stayed for 2 years, and then he went back to the UK and stayed with my mum. And he got enrolled in this very posh school. And there was this guy there who was one of the only other black kids there. And he kind of took my brother under his wing. And he was the one who introduced my brother to hip hop. And then when I moved back to London, my brother introduced me to him, and he became like an older brother to us both. His name was Jacob Sam LaRose. And
so I think I actually met him once.
Really?
Yes. I'm not sure whether he came.
A lovely guy.
He came to South Africa years ago.
Okay.
And I was still kind of partially involved in the poetry scene, so I think I met him briefly.
Okay. He actually, I think him and Ni Aikwe Parks jointly do Flip Tie Publishing. So he's still very active in kind of the literary spaces and everything. But he was the one who introduced us to, like, what would happen is he'd come and visit, and we'd be like, oh, Jacob, have you heard this? And he'd be like, oh, that's cute, guys. Have you heard this? And then he put on like this, like just different forms of music, and we'd not heard any of it. And it's because he was just really wired into like the West London music scene. Okay. And West London was generating new forms of music every other week. So he got us into like 4Hero, Bugs in the Attic, like all these like broken beat, drum and bass, different types of sounds. Even like the hip hop that he listened to was very other. So it's like, that was step one. Then step two was with the rise of neo soul, because neo soul, it wasn't popular. Like the music, D'Angelo, Maxwell, Erica, like it wasn't popular. It was like there was mainstream R&B with those guys doing what they were doing. And then there were these guys who were just doing the other stuff. And so when Zach and Jean-Claude were teaching me to DJ, we were all about the other stuff. And I think I brought that sensibility with me when I moved to Ghana. So I tried to actually recreate the kind of vibe that we had in the UK. So in the UK, we had a night called Amplified. And then in Ghana, I paired off with the producer Kwekwa Nancy and then DJ Lash. And we did a night called Soul in Motion. And it was the same thing, but just with a Ghanaian slant to it. So it's like we're playing songs from the Ghanaian underground, from all the Ghanaian musicians who are doing like just alternative sounding music, or just music that was a bit more free and less trend centered than what everybody else seemed to be doing at the time. And I've just ran with that. And so I've always tried to champion the people who are less heard. But then sometimes you find people who are very popular, so you can't call them underground anymore, but their sound is just different. It doesn't get as much airplay, that kind of, and I always try and champion like those kinds of people.
I mean, how would you say that the music industry has evolved from a Ghana perspective over the last, let's say, the last kind of 10, 15 years?
I would say that I think technology has played a really big part in changing the sound and the access. So I think Ghana, as far as our music goes, we've always been very kind of global. So at any point in time, we have like our music, and then we have music that we listen to from elsewhere in the world, especially whatever the music is that is big in like Black spaces across the world, particularly America and the UK. And so you've always had this kind of like cross-pollination. And I think that over the past 10 years, I think technology is what has really changed things. Let me put it to you like this. So when I was DJing in the UK, eventually the crew that I was with Amplified, there were 5 of us. So it's myself, Zeko, Jean-Claude. So Jean-Claude was from Jamaica. And then there was Bemi, who was Nigerian, and then Ahmed, who's Sudanese. And so if you look at the 5, you have a Ghanaian, a Nigerian, another Nigerian, Sudanese, and a Jamaican, right? So it's like a lot of Africans in there, and like 3/5 of us were West African. And I think we knew at the time that like whenever we'd visit home, like we'd come to the continent, the type of African music that you would be hearing is not the African music that we would be hearing in the UK. In the UK, it was still like Angelique Kidjo, Baba Mal, Youssou N'Dour, like quote unquote world music.
Yeah.
But we knew that like there were like young street sounds that were popping off. And so we actually did a night separate from our main Amplified night called Shakara, named after like the Fela song.
The Fela song,
and
yeah.
The idea was we're going to play music that is like the young street sound kind of music, right? So we start doing it. We do it for the first month. It's cool. Lots of like 2nd, 3rd generation Africans showing up. It's really cool, yeah. Then we do it a 2nd month, a 3rd month, and we start having a problem, which is that we're playing the same songs with all the other genres of music that we play. It's like you can go online, you can download, you can just find the music. It comes to you even. Like music companies will come and send stuff to you. But with this like young African kind of street music, right? unless we traveled, we could not get access to it. Or if you found it online through like SoulSeek or some other like Napster type of LimeWire situation. I'm really taking us back here.
Yeah.
What you'd find just like entire albums, but you had no way of knowing, okay, what is popular right now? What is top 10? Like, it's just there. And so the night kind of died a death. And what I realize now is it was a prototype Afrobeats night, basically.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the technology hadn't quite caught up. And so by the time I moved to Ghana, and by the time Azonto music is popping off, this is around I think 2012 London Olympics.
Yeah.
What's happening is there's just a lot more online activity. And so you find that like there are people who are blogging about the music. There are people who are posting the music. Somebody can drop a beat in like Nima here in Accra, and they put it online, and within minutes, someone in London is listening to it. By that evening, someone in London can be playing it in a club. That didn't exist at the time. And so that communication, I think, amplified things. And then you had this cross-pollination of sounds as well. So all of a sudden in Ghana, it's like, so we've had Hip Life, so Reggie, Rockstone, and all of those guys doing their stuff for a while. But then all of a sudden, like Ghana is exposed to like, I think MTV base Channel O, they start broadcasting. So people have access to like DSTV. They start hearing different sounds, and we're hearing different sounds from around the continent. So for example, South Africa is where like I visited Cape Town, I think in 2000. And that's when I fell in love with house. Before that, I hated house music. But then I came to South Africa, like Cape Town in the 2000s, discovered like South African house, fell in love with house music. And we start hearing that on Channel O here in Ghana. Yeah. And so you have this combination of like influences from there, influences from elsewhere, and then you start hearing it in the music. So I'm a DJ. And the first thing that I notice is that the sound, the speed of the sound, as DJs, we measure in beats per minute.
Yeah.
And the beats per minute for your average like hip hop R&B song is, I don't know, let's say 97 to 105 beats per minute. All of a sudden in Ghana, around the time that you have Channel O kind of like giving us like Kwaito and stuff like that, and then the UK at this point in time has always been into like more electronic forms of music. And so they are really into kind of like UK funky, speed garage, that kind of stuff, just before the advent of grime. Yeah. And then in America, they've discovered uns music. Like everybody is saying that like Drake and Beyonce are bringing back uns music. But I mean, the Detroit cats have been doing it for years.
Yeah, absolutely.
New York had been doing it for a while, but like all of a sudden, mainstream American R&B was having an uns moment. So you have like David Guetta and everything he produced with Black Eyed Peas. So like, I've got a feeling that tonight's going to be a good night. Usher, DJ's Got Me Falling in Love Again, or Oh My Gosh. Chris Brown, yeah. Like all these songs are
yeah.
And so all of a sudden in Ghana, the beats per minute also start to rise to match the rest of the world. And so all of a sudden, everything is moving at about 110 to 120 beats per minute. And that's when Azonto is born. So Azonto comes about basically because of globalization.
No, I mean, it's interesting because when I joined kind of Twitter in the early days and started kind of linking up, because the early days you know whoever you followed, you could see their tweets. It's not like it's not as restrictive as it is now. So
yes.
If I followed you, I could see your communication with everybody.
Yes.
And then around that time, I also met DJ Black.
Okay.
And so he came down 2010 World Cup. He was here for, I think he was here for about 3 weeks.
Yeah, he did Big Brother, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, so he was here about 3 weeks and he stayed at my house. So that's when I also met Rab, because Rab came down and then stayed with us for about a week.
Rest in peace.
But around that time, he eventually, like you're saying, what technology gave us was on a Friday night or on a Saturday night, I would sit at home at my desk while doing other things and play his show. What Weekend Warmer and, Friday night show, Saturday night show. Yeah. And there were guys around, there's also Kobby who's in the UK. There's Jules who's in Canada. And we were interacting on Twitter and all plugging into the show.
Okay.
And so having conversations on Twitter while listening to the show and then being exposed to what was coming out of Ghana, as well as his ear and his lens in terms of how he puts it together and how he approaches it. And, so like you're saying, I mean, when you say Azonto, I remember being in Accra, because that's 2008, 2009 was when I started visiting Accra. I didn't visit Accra my whole life.
Okay.
And, being on Oxford Street and watching guys dance down the road with every car playing Azonto. So, yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. It is interesting how technology is the positive side has created that, has created that feedback loop and that cross-pollination, as you put it.
Yeah, like just social media, the internet as a whole. And then I guess the other thing is transitioning from like 1970s to 1980s, I think was the death of live bands. So like, because Ghana went through like all these coups d'etats and stuff like that, under the military, there were like all these curfews. And so all the people who, in order to make music, they had to learn instruments. They fled, and they fled into like the UK, the States, Germany in particular, and or they just went back to the villages, or they went into the church. And so all of a sudden, the live band culture in Ghana becomes like a church thing. But then you have those musicians who are like in Germany, in particular, like Hamburg, and they start messing with like electronic music. And so you get like that kind of bogger high life from the 1980s and stuff. But then fast forward now, and again, you don't need to play instruments to make music. And so with the wide availability of everything from Serato and Virtual DJ to Fruity Loops and stuff like that, like I remember interviewing EL, and he was talking about how EL was talking about how he was roommates with DJ Jules, who's now just Jules. And how like Jules, I think it was on Fruity Loops, and he would teach him, stuff like that. Like, so it's like just, it's become easier and easier to make music, and Ghanaians have definitely benefited from that.
And it does feel like there's a bit more originality coming into it.
So yeah, like I feel like there was a time I had Panji Anoff and Manifest. No, that year was EL. It was actually Panji Anoff and EL. They went up to Ashesi at my invitation to do like a talk about like the music. And I remember them talking about how in the beginning it's like, sure, Reggie basically comes up with like, he popularizes this hip life sound that like, so it's like rapping and local. But he still had the accent that he had. And the president that we had at the time was Rawlings. And it's like Rawlings had this accent. Like these accents were like, they didn't sound like they were from Ghana. And so for the longest time, anyone who wanted to rap in Ghana, especially if they were rapping in English. You could be speaking with them and they'd have the most Ghanaian accent. As
So the
soon as
minute
they start
yeah.
rapping, the accent becomes some kind of pseudo-American kind of accent. And EL was basically saying that he was in the studio at one point, I think, with the producer Jay So. And he was trying to drop a line and he couldn't remember the line. And so he just put in some gun. And so he started saying "que" and stuff like that. And Jay So was like, yo, keep that in there. And so all of a sudden you start seeing, it's not to say that he was the first, but like,
yeah,
there used to be this divide between like GH rap, which was like more English leaning, slightly more kind of middle class, I guess. And then hip life, which was like, we are taking like local language, local sound, mixing it with hip hop. And then you had this joining together of these two things when people really started using a lot more pidgin English, which is a bit more universal. And I think that coincided with like the arrival of Azonto as a sound. And thereafter, it's just been like an explosion. And so you just, I guess you just have all these different influences that just come together. Yeah.
You are listening to the Listen to Your Footsteps podcast, a podcast in which I chat to Africans from a cross-section of society and sectors, including art, culture, design, business, and creativity, to name a few. I delve into their journeys, the decisions they've taken to get to where they are, how they do what they do, and everything in between. Essentially, we go wherever the conversation takes us. So just to change tack a bit, what drives you now? What's the spaces that you're looking at? I mean, you're doing this PhD, you're still writing, etc. What are you working towards, if that makes sense?
It makes sense. 5 years ago, I became a father. And so I think if I've always kind of thought of myself as part of a bigger community. And sometimes that community is like my immediate community. And then sometimes it's Ghana. And then sometimes it's global community. But I think in terms of professionally, what I've been driving towards is I want a future in which Ghanaian creativity is taken seriously and it continues to be something that is accessible, and it becomes even more so, and it can put food on people's tables. And I want this to be as broad and diverse as possible. So that's on the professional side. I think I'm very interested in anything that grows the kind of creative community. And so I try as much as I can to make time for younger creatives, younger music journalists and DJs and curators and stuff like that. Not just in music, but just across the arts as a whole. I'm very invested in that. And I tend to think of all such people as my community, whether they know me or whether like we are close or not. So on the professional side, that's what I'm moving towards. But I think on the personal side, I just want to, by the time I leave, I want to have helped to move our culture to a place where we understand ourselves better and we have more empathy towards each other. And I say this because I feel like social media-wise in particular, we live in very unempathetic times. And I don't think that's sustainable. And I think that when I say know ourselves, I think I'm deeply aware of the fact that like I am on a continent whose history has often been smudged or forgotten or suppressed. And as a teacher, that I see the effects of this, particularly as a teacher, but then also just as a Ghanaian. And I think that there is so much that needs to be done to help us to understand who we are right now and then allow us to move forward. So I think about those kinds of things a lot. And I think about them with regards to my son or my late brother's son in the UK. Like, what is the Ghana that I'm leaving for them? And so I think on a personal level, I think about those things a lot. And then on a super personal level, just in terms of me, I'm just trying to move towards like peace. I'm just really trying to move towards like personal peace. Like I said earlier, I think at the age of 45 now, I feel wise. And so I feel like I just want to move towards a very peaceful existence, towards a loving existence, and towards empathy. Yeah.
How have you navigated grief? I know that you lost your brother, and
Yeah.
we'll also just, I mean, we've come out of a 2-3 year period globally,
Yeah.
where it doesn't actually feel like there's a lot of grief that we haven't acknowledged and you haven't dealt with. And I'll say, so for example, I lost an extremely close friend who was in essence my brother, but this is before COVID.
I see.
And my father about a year before that. But in a strange way, because I had to navigate or make sense of grief, which I don't think you ever kind of, there's no like finish line, right?
No.
But it helped me because I also lost some friends during COVID, but it helped me navigate that better, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes sense. I think I guess one of the reasons why 45 actually is meaning something for me is because it's the first time that I've felt light since 2020. My younger brother fell out of a window in London in April 2020, having had like a break from reality. Like, I think in the aftermath of like what happened, I've come to realize that there might be schizophrenia on my mother's side of the family, or at least on one side of the family. And it's something that I've found evidence of and I'm looking into. But basically, so I was just waiting on the car to pass. So I think that threw me for an absolute loop. My mother had died a few years before that, and I was really close to my mom, and she died of a very sudden cancer. We got to know about it, like from the moment she was admitted to the hospital. They told her she was in the final stages. She never saw the outside world again. And she went, it was like, I think it took her in the span of, I don't know, like a month. And so what had helped me to deal with that, as difficult as that was the fact that my mom had spent her life preparing my brother and I for life without her. And so it felt like, okay, we're just moving to the next stage. But then losing my brother in the way that I did, like it broke me. It broke me completely, and it just completely shifted the things that I wanted. It took me a long time. And to directly answer your question, some of the things that helped, I think the first thing that helped, in the beginning, it was community to some extent. But then there's a saying that Eli Tete, a friend of mine, Eli, he has this thing that he once told me that really makes sense. He says, on a normal day, your cup of like your capacity is like a cup, and it can fill like maybe halfway up with your concerns, the concerns of your friends, family, etc., etc. It fills maybe halfway up. But when you're in grief, your capacity, your cup fills all the way to the top and is overflowing. And it's taking you this much to just contain yourself and your own emotions. You don't have space and time for other people's emotions. And I've had reason to think about that a lot since then, because that's what happened to me. I had so much that I was processing that I just pushed everyone away. And I also did this. Therapy also helped. And therapy helped me to understand that besides the fact of my brother's death and my mother's death, I'd been dealing with a lot of abandonment. So like when my dad left us in London to move to Ghana in 1986, when my grandmother died, etc., etc., etc. So these were like abandonments and losses. And I think my brother's death was like the last straw, and it taught my soul a lesson. And the lesson was that the people that you love, you will lose all of them. And so act accordingly and brace yourself in advance for the pain that comes with that. And so I entered a space of solitude. Like, solitude is what really helped me. Like, it gave me space to process my emotions, to think about like myself. And I needed that. And so solitude has been very, very healing for me. Solitude. And then bit by bit, from a place of solitude, with encouragement from like key people, I've rediscovered community. But I think for most people, at least most people that I know, they really fall into community and tap into like the love of community, the comfort from community. For me, it wasn't like that at all. It was the opposite. I was just like, I want to be on my own. And so that's what happened. Yeah, so the things that have helped.
I guess also because in some instances, from the outside looking in, it often feels like you're at the center of the community, and you provide that support for so many people in your own way. And I guess in that moment, sometimes it's you need to actually step away from everything.
Yeah, that's definitely been the case for me. I think I give myself quite freely. I give people a lot of access to me, maybe too much access. And so I guess it has a good side and a bad side. I think everybody reached for me. Like, I can't say that like people didn't reach for me when like they realized that like I was in grief. But you made this point earlier about like the grief that comes from the unresolved grief of COVID, because my brother died just before like the COVID lockdown. So in fact, I buried my brother over Zoom. Like we buried him next to my mom in the UK, and I couldn't go to the funeral because COVID, the borders were literally shut. And I think that it was very weird losing someone at the height of COVID, because it also meant that there were things like usually when somebody dies, you go and you see the bereaved and you give them a hug. For example, there were no hugs in that time. There was no holding in that time. There was just a lot of literal distance and people having to be there for you from physical distance. And so I think it was just a perfect storm. And you're quite right. Like, whereas usually I've been there for a lot of people, I do think people try to be there for me, but it's not what I needed at the time. And it's taken me about 2 years to get back to a point where I'm reconnecting with society. Things got pretty rough at a point in time. Like, I had a slip disc, lost the ability to walk briefly, had a back spasm 2 weeks after that. That same night discovered a tumor in my back, which turned out not to be a cancerous tumor, but a lipoma, which apparently like you can either have operated out or mine just, it went after I started to kind of take better care of myself. But yeah, things got quite rough.
I will say that it's been inspiring and positive to see you coming back. Because yeah, it's a strange world that we live in, right? Because we have social media, but we're also, I think you are as well as I am, but a lot of us are deliberate about what we share. So you'll share your vulnerability, but you don't share all of it. And sometimes people that make the assumption that, what they see is the entirety of the person.
Yeah.
But also just kind of watching you, to a certain extent, sharing that struggle and sharing that grief and sharing that journey after your brother passed in particular. And then also us, briefly interacting with, I remember I was trying to get you to read my book, and you were in a particular space, and understanding, because you get to see the journey from a distance, understanding where a person is. And it's what you're talking about, because I also believe that one of the biggest issues that we have is a lack of empathy. But watching you kind of come back where you have a playlist up, you have a little thing that you've written, and it's through that I think those of us on the outside get to say or get to see that, okay, he's coming back to us to a certain extent.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. I really withdrew, and it wasn't a conscious decision. It's something that kind of you wake up and you realize that you don't have capacity before you actually understand that there's such a thing as capacity, and you because it's something that you take for granted. And I've just really learned in this time to listen to myself. I've also had several false starts where I think I'm okay, but I'm not okay. I think one of the things that I've realized about myself is sometimes I can think that I'm okay, but when I look at my unread WhatsApp message count, that's been the closest thing I have to a state of mind ometer, a state of mind ometer, right? And so at the height of things, I would have, like right now, I never have more than 10 unread messages. At the height of everything, I had about 150. I would bring it down to 50 and I'd be like, oh, I'm so much better now. And I'd try and take things on. And then I'd just not have capacity without realizing that I don't have capacity. And then I'd end up letting people down. And so I've had to really, really learn how to listen to myself and be just like really, really listen to myself. And that's definitely helped. So there's another point I was going to make, but I can't remember. So but I think that it is definitely a journey. And I think that often when things like this happen and people fall into grief, we measure them by the way that we usually measure them. And I guess part of that comes from like social media perception of like, okay, so it's like you can see that this is how a person is. But I think one thing that has come to be important to me, because there was another thing that helped to heal me, which was writing. I poured myself into writing about my brother, myself, my father, my family, and that was quite healing actually. But there was a lot of anger at the beginning, and because of that, I really started to value just a kind of almost radical honesty in a sense. I know that's the term that gets used, but I feel like I was angry to do with the fact that like there might be schizophrenia in my family, but because we don't talk about these things, we didn't know, and then my brother may have died partly on account of that. I've been angry about other things that have happened in my in my family, etc., etc. And so I think I just reached this point where I was like, as much as I can, I feel like I am going to talk as openly as possible, in ways that I hope don't hurt, but ultimately move us collectively towards truth and towards empathy. One thing that I came to realize in that time and through my writing is that I've come to the thing that, like, I feel like we treat, like, moving without empathy means that we either put people on pedestals or we treat them as monsters.
Yes.
And there's very little in between. And being on a pedestal is not actually any better than being made a monster. Both of these things ultimately, my conclusion is that both of these things ultimately dehumanize. And so that's the reason why they say, oh, kill your heroes are going to disappoint you. They disappoint you because you stop thinking of them as human and you think of them as something higher when they are just human. And so they have these dramatic falls and then cancel. And with monsters, it's kind of like what we do is, yes, there is personal responsibility always, and people have to hold themselves accountable and be taken accountable for things. But there are also, and I guess because I'm studying sociology, like, this really comes to bear, there are social forces that are responsible for making people who they are in addition to their own decisions. But we don't want to look at that at all. And so we just consign people to the state of monster, like they're just some aberration. And it doesn't allow us to actually grapple with difficult things in our society, especially here in Africa, where we have these kind of cultures of silence. Like, I'm an Akan. Like, I come from, like, Koforidua, and so I'm Akan. And I know that, like, in traditional Akan culture, in traditional, let's say, Ashanti culture, you don't talk directly to somebody. Like, to talk directly is considered to talk like a child. And so traditionally, you're actually supposed to say the thing in a kind of storied, kind of elaborate manner. That shows that you're an adult, you see. But what that means is that there are so many things in society that need to be talked about, but they either go unsaid or they are kind of hidden behind smoke and mirrors. And I feel like that is wildly incompatible with a social media age in which every single person alive right now has more access to information than almost anyone in their entire ancestral line. And that includes people who do not have access to the internet because they are, like, receiving more information still courtesy of people who do have access to the internet. So let's say, like, through the radio, for example, because I was a journalist, I know news will come from the internet and we will put it onto the airwaves, and people who don't have phones but they have radios, they will hear that. And so you have this super age of information alongside these cultures of silence, and the two are incompatible, and it's killing us because it doesn't help us to explain why we have certain social problems. Like, let's say, divorce. Like, divorce rates have been rising in Ghana very steadily for a while, and people tell you, oh, it's just because feminists, or it's just this. But it's actually, there's, like, a lot that is going on that we need to talk about, and we're not talking about it. And so I've just resolved myself to, as much as I can, just talk about the things.
Yeah. And I think we're all better for it. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you very, very much for having me. Yeah. And yeah, now I need to read your book.
No pressure, no stress.
Yeah, no, but thank you for having me. Yeah, like, I've been watching you for a good couple of years now. We've been following each other for years now.
Yeah, no, it's I think we were talking about it the other day. It's kind of, I guess we find each other, we find ourselves.
Yeah.
In terms of the world, and
Yeah.
I think also Ghana with its history. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about those of us who are like second generation, who grew up outside.
Yes.
And there's a connection and a detachment that, you live within that contradiction. And that contradiction is the external versus the internal. So internally, a part of you feels connected and wants to be connected and is looking for ways to be connected. And then the external is, but you're not quite enough. You're not Ghanaian enough. You don't speak the language. Are you a real Ghanaian? And I think it's a
oh god, yeah, that one.
It's a global. I think it's a global conversation, but
Definitely.
with countries like Ghana, where from very early, around independence and right after independence, you had so many Ghanaians going across the world, and that's how my father ended up in Germany. So there's that journey that our parents took, and in some instances our grandparents took, to try and create kind of better life and opportunity, etc. Which then creates that element of detachment. And so what social media has helped me do is create some kind of connection with people. So even if it's not, even if it's not, say, the country and broader society, but there are people that I've been able to create connection with, which ensures that to a certain extent I feel part of a certain community within the space.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think for all my beefs with Twitter, that's one of the things that I credit Twitter with, just helping me to find community, including yourself. And without it, that just would not have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, bruv.
Thank you, Kojo. Thank you.
Have yourself a good day. The Listen to Your Footsteps podcast is produced by Zebra Culture. If you have ideas of what we can do better, people you'd like us to have a conversation with, or would just like to share a thought, you can email me on info@zebraculture.com. To check out past episodes, go to kojobuffer.com/podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, Listen to Your Footsteps, check out kojobuffer.com/book. There are details on the various spaces it's available at. I'd also appreciate it if you could leave a review or comment wherever you listen to your podcasts. Finally, there's the Zebra Culture by Kojo Buffer newsletter, where on a weekly basis, I share a curated list of articles, playlists, videos, etc. that have caught my attention. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed having it.